name's Rob Fraser. I'm the founder and CEO of Outway, which is a performance sock brand located in Victoria, BC. Started the business in 2016 off the back of a 10-year cycling career, which I kind of call my first life, and what I thought would be my entire life. But young kid, dreams of becoming a professional athlete. Did it. Raced around the world on my bike. Did downhill mountain bike racing, which is the like downhill ski equivalent on a bike. Raced for the Canadian national team 5 years in a row. Got a lot of great experiences, and then slowly but surely realized as I got into my early 20s that it's expensive to live, and cycling wasn't going to pay the bills too far in the future. It's a young guy sport, so I started kind of looking to, what my second act would be. Didn't know what that was for a couple of years in a transitional period. Went to school, was trying to figure things out, and really just out of a fear of getting a real job or going into real life after this kind of career of cycling and doing my own thing, I thought, hey, starting a business sounds like a cool idea. I had no business experience, no real plan other than trying to avoid real life. So yeah, laying in bed, kind of September 2016, going into second year of school, I was like, I'm just going to give this thing a shot. And that was the simple insight. It was just like I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna try to build a brand, a business, and that ended up being socks because in cycling, socks are a part of culture. They're a way that we express ourselves on the bike. Like generally we're given a jersey and shorts and everything else, and you look kind of uniform with your team or others. And socks were this area of your kit that you could have a bit of freedom and be different than everyone else. And it was actually how my parents and others would kind of spot me on the hill, be like, oh, there's Robin, kind of like the loud, blue and purple socks or whatever. And so when I transitioned into, everyday life outside of athlete life, I kept wearing those socks. And before even starting a sock brand, I was kind of labeled in school the sock guy because I would always have I always wear black, like pretty much like everything except my socks. And so it was very obvious and I like wearing shorts too, like even in the cooler seasons. It was very obvious that I was like wearing these very loud socks, but realized quickly that these cycling socks I had weren't great for other things. They weren't super comfortable for all day. They weren't great for running. So I kind of went on a search for, where's the active wear sock? And I was underwhelmed with the offerings. Everything seemed to be sport specific or occasion specific, like dress socks or, luxury socks or sports socks. It's like, the whole apparel industry had shifted towards athleisure wear.
Mhm.
Why were socks left behind? And so we went out to solve that problem. And yeah, now we're 6 years later, still solving that problem, sold millions of pairs, and we've grown into one of the kind of leading brands in North America selling socks direct to consumer online. So long-winded elevator pitch. It's
Mhm.
a long elevator. We're going to the top 100th floor, but yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
And so, you're sitting down, you're thinking of what business you want to do, and socks were always a part of it. Do you go out talk to other people? Do you start trying to find like a distributor? Like, how does it go from an idea for you to being like, hey, we're actually going to give this a shot and try to make a business out of it? Was it initially in the socks? Were you trying to do other things and just realized I like socks? It's kind of was always part of my identity, and let's see if we can kind of make this a business on itself.
Yeah, day one, I didn't really know what the product would be. I knew I wanted to build a brand and I wanted to build a brand in the athletic space. So that
Mhm.
was kind of like the first idea. And then I asked myself, like, what brands as an athlete did I really look up to? I really liked Lululemon. I really liked Red Bull. I liked how those brands stood for something and they created a cult following that was synonymous with quality or performance. And I really liked that. And then thought like, okay, I think apparel is like a good spot. I kind of understand it as an athlete. I understood, and I had apparel sponsors in the past, so
Mhm.
I kind of understood like how to reverse engineer the contracts and distribution and stuff like that, and had some level of understanding
Mhm.
of the business model, even though I had no business experience
Yeah.
really. Um, and then thought from there, what's like the lowest risk item of apparel? I was like socks, and then oh yeah, I kind of like socks, so I started looking into kind of the market opportunity, and that was how I kind of landed on it. The goal early on was actually to build more of an apparel company. Um, but once we started getting into socks, I realized that there was just so much opportunity to
Mhm.
continually innovate there, even though the category itself is quite large. It had been overlooked. And as a Canadian brand, there weren't many Canadian sock companies as well. So I was just like, hey, let's try and slowly but surely own this market. And I think we're well on our way.
Mhm. And why do you think socks were just overlooked? Just because they're not as typically? I mean, socks are actually kind of popular now. I mean, more my experience on the dress sock side. It went from like nothing when I was in school to now it's like socks are like, because ties are no longer things, how you accessorize. Why do you think socks were overlooked? Just because no one initially attributed them to being a way of standing out? Or was it just the fact that, a t-shirt can be worth hundreds of dollars where socks are typically, I'm not saying lower price, but it's not typically something you'd consider first possibly? Or why do you think socks were overlooked?
I think a part of both, but more the latter. I think if you're going to set out to start an apparel company, socks are the lowest margin thing you can sell, basically out of everything else, like you mentioned. And kind of the secret in the apparel space is that most things cost roughly the same to produce. So even like a pair of socks all the way up to a hoodie, there's not a huge spread in the cost out to manufacture it. We're talking dollars. But the amount that you can sell those products for vary on hundreds of dollars. Whereas you can have a sweater you purchase for $300-400 from a nice reputable brand, whereas the socks have an upper limit around 25 bucks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those two products cost within the tens of dollars range to produce, and maybe less. So the margins are much more attractive to go right into apparel, and I think that's why a lot of the existing brands, apparel brands, didn't focus on innovating the sock category because it was not a really great return on capital.
Mm-hmm.
There were brands around when we started and a little before that started to separate socks from apparel and focus just on socks. And so they proved the model out. And then we looked at that model and we're like, okay, this can be niched down even
Mm-hmm.
more into kind of athletics and more active wear and more kind of like the yoga pant of the foot. And so I think it's a common misconception that a lot of people look at like really large bloated industries and be like, well, if it could have been done, it must have been done.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you continually see over and over again there's ways to find different niches, or there's available technology now that allows for either business model or product innovation. I think like the one I always point to is like razor blades. It's one of the oldest inventions, but then Dollar Shave Club comes around and innovates on the business model around subscription because now technology is in a place where we can do that. And so socks, I think, were similar. They were for so long just this kind. It was like I think one of the first invented clothing items too, because it was knit. It was you could do it with your
Mm-hmm.
hands. It was quite easy, and I think for a long time people have just accepted that that's the way they are, and we still see that today. A lot of people will spend, like $1,000 getting all new gear for cycling, and then just wear their crappy socks from Costco. And we're like, hey, you spent all this money for $20 more. You can kind of complete the kit. So
Mm-hmm.
we're still educating the market, which makes me like realize that there's still work to do here. And yeah, I think that's why it was overlooked. Is I think a lot of people just realized, if it could be done, it was done, and even if it could be, is the margin there? And we're finding that it is.
Mm-hmm. So you go from being a professional athlete, and for most parents and friends, you're like, that's a pretty risky industry to try to make a profession in. Like being an athlete is one of those things where you're gonna fail. That's also very similar to being an entrepreneur. So when you said, hey, friends, family, I'm gonna become an entrepreneur, I'm gonna start this business, how did people feel about that? Were they like, hey, you've kind of always done things on your own? I mean, being a professional athlete to some extent is really self driven. Like your effort is your results. It's not really like, I can't do, I'm not going to do anything like working for some companies. You can just kind of hide and get out by. Not, you can't do that while being an athlete. So, kind of what did your community think about when you kind of came with this idea and we're going to try and make it public? Were they already supported? Were they like, man, you need to get a real job? Like you tried a professional athlete thing? Like, how did people view it when you told them, I'm going to make some socks, I'm going to make millions?
I think uh, it's shifted over time, obviously.
Mhm.
I think the initial reaction, like, oh shit, here he goes again, like, because like I had originally out of high school gone to university and then
Mhm.
dropped out to chase the bike dream. I got my
Mhm.
first contract while I was in university. Like, I was racing competitively and like for the last years of high school. And I got my first real deal, like
Mhm.
when I went to university, dropped out. And so that was kind of the first moment where my fairly conservative, like family, not, like in their views of just going like to go to school, get the job. I don't come from a family of entrepreneurs. They're just like, oh man, like he's throwing away a sure thing for this maybe thing, but
Mhm.
whatever. We'll support him. And then I retired from that, which they're like, okay, that's good because it's also a dangerous sport. So my mom's all like
Mhm.
stoked, and she's like, okay, now he's gonna go back to school. And so I go back to school, and then I start this other thing. I'm like, I think I'm gonna drop out again. So yeah, they're like, definitely they were like, oh man, like here he goes again. But I think I had proven enough that like I'm driven and I'm not doing it half-assed. So definitely in the early days, though, I don't think anyone expected it to work. Just like when I started cycling, it was like he's just messing around, and surely this will come to an end. And um, but it just started working. I get when I like decide I'm going to do something, I don't matter. It doesn't really matter to me how much like experience I have or advantages. I'm just like going to figure it out. And so I went pretty hard, and I ended up dropping out after second year, and here we are 6 years later, and it's like any time a business can still go down. So, but I like to think we're doing the right things, and we're in a pretty good spot. So, yeah, now they look back and they're like, surely it was always going to work out this way. Like Rob's driven, and he's proven it again. But I guarantee during that time, everyone was just kind of like shaking their head, kind of being like, "Here we go, round two." And I know for a fact, like even like years in when we were making at this point millions, people in my neighborhood would still like comment on her. Is Rob still doing that like sock thing? Is he done with that yet and gonna go back to school and get a real job? And I just kind of personally love that it's kind of now shifted to where like my business or personally could just go buy any of their businesses. So it's
Yeah.
like it's a good flipping of the scale. And I'm sure there's no bad
Mhm.
intentions with their comments, but it always gave me extra fuel to be like
Mhm.
not do the traditional thing.
That's super funny because I've heard some of similar stories. I had, a few friends of friends who were content creators, and they're like, "Oh, you're doing this YouTube thing," and someone's like, "Yeah, I made 7 figures last year," and they're like, "Oh yeah, I always knew that was a good industry to go into." It's like when things shift. Once you're successful, like I always told this Rob guy, the socks, this is the business. You should always do it. So
Yeah.
it's funny how history changes once success is seen.
Well, my story on this is like everyone had that kid in high school that knew, like, thought they were going to be a rapper, and everyone looked at them like just like kind of shaking their head. They're like, "This guy's never." Some of those people make it, you know what I mean? And then those high school kids that were like ripping on this guy are going like, "Oh, I knew Eminem or whatever," right?
Mhm.
Like, but it's just so like rare that these people make it. So you look kind of crazy or kind of on the
Mhm.
edge until you actually do it. But I always think like you got to bet on those
Mhm.
people sometimes because they got big goals.
Mhm. And did you find, I know talking to some athletes, the transition going from like athletics to business can sometimes be a little bit different because obviously you're driven and competitive, but a lot of times, like being an athlete, it's like very self fulfilling. You put in the effort, you get the results, you're kind of competing against yourself. Where in business, there's a lot more probably out of your control. You have to kind of deal with more people. You have to be, to some extent, a personality or at least friendly, like have conversations. Did you find that a tough transition? Or because you were used to working with sponsors and other people within the business that it wasn't that big of a shift on your mindset?
Yeah. Man, you're asking great questions. This is great. It's it was something I've had to work on over the last 6 years. Like definitely like coming out of sport, it's like you're hard charging. You have to have you got to have the confidence. You got to kind of be a little bit mysterious. Like part of the game is kind of like psyching out competition too, right? Where in business, like you're right, you have to eventually build a team and then also delegate to that team. Like as an athlete, you don't delegate the work. You do the work yourself.
Mhm.
You have people around you delegating to you, like your coach and your trainer and whatnot. Um, and so that was definitely learning. I definitely know from like business relationships that didn't work out well in the early days. Like it was probably hard to work with me as someone that was pretty hard charging. Like I recognize that. At the same time, I think it attributes a lot of our success to it, is we're like just
Mhm.
relentlessly pursuing these things and not willing to give up. Um, I'd say more than anything, the hardest thing to like transition I'm still dealing with is that, like, unlike an athlete, it's like, yeah, there are a lot of things in business that are out of your control,
Mhm.
whether or not it's like even legal issues or manufacturing issues or whatever. Like perhaps in sport you could equate that to kind of like a mechanical issue with the
Mhm.
equipment or whatever, like but generally all the same people are kind of like have those same issues, and it's a level playing field, whereas in business sometimes things are just somewhat unfair and
Mhm.
unfortunate. So um, that's probably, yeah, been the hardest thing, is to like realize, yeah, in business it's like definitely not all about you. I think
Mhm.
your job as the founder and the CEO is to almost make it not about you as quickly as possible, and like delegate and build a team and an infrastructure that works around you so that you're not a single point of failure. I see way too many, young founders that like, this is my baby, I need to protect it. It's like, well, it's a business, first of all.
Mhm.
Second of all, your job is to, create value here and make sure that it lives you. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, or else it's a lifestyle business, and that's fine, but that's not what we're trying to build here.
Mhm. It's always interesting. I feel like a lot of people do compare businesses to children, and it's funny because there's a lot of like analogies you can use that are very, very similar. Like when with the idea you have to nurture it, put effort into it, and then kind of get it to like 18 years old till it can kind of set free, or till you can IPO or kind of leave it. But it is interesting that one thing you talk about, I don't know if your views on this, but like a lot of times people, when building a business, tend to be very secretive, or maybe in the early 2010s was more popular. Like, hey, don't tell anyone about it. They're going to steal my idea. But then at a certain point, you realize it's kind of hard to steal someone's idea and make a business. Did you deal with that where you're like, hey, I can't tell people I have this great idea that they're going to steal it? And did it change? Or did you find like, hey, how public you are about things really matters early on, or at least through the process?
Yeah, my stance on this is that ideas are cheap.
Hmm.
Execution's everything. I think the founders that are like, this is my idea, I need to protect it, I need to sign NDAs, like they never actually go and build anything.
Yeah.
They're just idea people, and like they're the worst people. They're the people that take your time and pick your brain and stuff like that. It's just like, just go build something. Like
Hmm.
I've always been, my tendency is to like overshare, and so like I definitely try not to do that publicly as much anymore,
Hmm.
because like it does at a certain size put a target on you around
Hmm.
different things. But in the early days, like the number one thing I think you could do is like be super vocal about what you're doing, because then people rally behind you. Like everyone loves to kind of like get behind the person trying, and then once they have some success, you get an equal amount of people that want to take you down. So
Yeah.
that's maybe when you shut up a little bit. But in the early days, like people want to get behind you. People want to help people doing things, especially entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurship community I found is so supportive of people doing things, and not so supportive of people saying they're going to do things.
Hmm.
So as long as you're backing it up with action, I would say like default to kind of talking about what you're doing, because you'll find it kind of increases your credibility, and B, it attracts other like-minded people that can help you, right?
Hmm.
Because like entrepreneurship by default is pretty lonely. You're working on a business and a problem that's in the early days quite exclusive to you. No one's done this exact thing before. There's not a playbook. Generally, if you don't come from an entrepreneurial family, who do you really go to? You can't talk to your employees about these things, because that's sometimes not appropriate, and they also won't understand. So like,
Hmm.
who do you go to when you receive a cease and desist letter?
Yeah.
Or who do you go to when there's financial issues in the business? So that's the kind of benefit of building a network. And I think the best way to build a network is to kind of start talking about what you're doing.
Hmm. I think that's great advice. I think a lot of times, like you said, you think initially that someone's going to steal your idea, that, hey, this idea might be very special. And then you start talking to people, and either one, you realize, damn, this idea I had is actually an idea, not a business. I have to start pivoting and talking to real customers, which is very common, especially on the tech side, where you're like, this is going to be a great problem I'm solving, and no one has that problem. And you're like, damn, I should have asked people before this. Or it's the opposite. People are like, yeah, it's a great idea, but I'm doing my own thing. I don't care to steal your idea. And I think, like you said, building community is so important because people like to support you. I think that's one misconception. Like everyone's trying to screw you over. And obviously, once there's success and there's money, that happens. But when you're a early founder, they're like, what? It's no effort for me to screw you over. And people like to see others succeed to some extent as well. One thing you also taught, I saw you post on LinkedIn as well about this, is like this work life balance idea. Now, this is like a hotly debated topic. I think mostly just the definition of what work life balance is. I think that is what very different for everyone. But a lot of times you really can't have that work life balance, but there's still a limit to not being burnt out. So, what would you define work life balance as? But at the same time, is how do you prevent burnout then, if that's one of the big concerns with work life balance?
Yeah, I love this topic, and I love to kind of push people's buttons on LinkedIn
Mhm.
about it, because it's quite fun. LinkedIn's, a sandbox. You might as well play
Yeah.
in it. It's a bit of a dumpster fire at best.
Mhm.
So, um, I mean, like my point is that like work life balance, I don't like the term, and that's
Mhm.
mainly what I kind of like push back on, and why I say like if you're trying to achieve anything great, the idea of anything to do with balance is
Mhm.
just ridiculous, because by definition you would need to be in equilibrium kind of across different things, whereas like if you want to be the best athlete or entrepreneur, like your job is literally to tip the scale in your favor. So by definition it's going to be out of balance,
Mhm.
right? And so what that doesn't mean though is that like you need to separate things like taking care of your health, taking care of your mental health, um, making sure you're getting enough sleep. All of those
Mhm.
things that if you kind of let off the gas on, you're going to lead towards burnout. That I see as part of the work. Um,
Hmm.
what I see as not part of the work is things like going and partying, things like not making the right decisions around your lifestyle and who you hang around. Like, that's why, like, even the people you hang around with, that's maybe not in like a full, like, we're head down working context. Like, I see that as part of the work. And the way I think about this is like an athlete. Um, One of the biggest parts of the work is your recovery routine. They're not on the court in a
Mhm,
basketball, or if they're not on the court dribbling and shooting, like if that's the actual work or whatever, playing the game.
mhm,
But the recovery is equally, if not more important, because like, what's the point? If they can't come back to the court the next day a better version of
mhm,
themselves, then what are they doing? So when people are like, oh, but what about time for X, Y, and Z? My point is like, no, like, you do those things, but with the intent of holistically improving at what you want to be great at,
mhm,
and making sure that you don't give any time to the things that I would consider normal, like going out and partying. Like, these things you just have to kind of not do when you want to be
mhm,
great at something. Um, and also just, yeah, so that's kind of my stance on. That's why I don't like balance. I love the idea of like work life synergy,
mhm,
or something of that effect, whereas like everything you're doing is like geared towards just being a better version of yourself. Because like, when it comes to entrepreneurship, taking care of your mind, body, and all that other stuff, like, it makes you more effective at your job and
mhm,
what you do. It makes you sharper. Like, there's no denying this. If anyone's ate bad and then ate well, what it's like to feel good when you eat well. You know what it's like when your brain's just like whippy smart and when it's
mhm,
slow. You know what it's like to be trying to do something hungover or doing something
mhm,
perfect health. Like, this is not a debate. And so like my whole thing is like, avoid the things that make you slower and weaker in your job, and just like optimize on the things that make you better.
mhm,
But then I see so many people that are like, what I hate the most is like, people are like, I want to start a business, I want it to be a huge success, and I want to do it in a 40-hour work week. I'm like, you're just never going to make it. You're just
mhm,
never going to make it. You know why? Because like, business is competition. It's a full contact sport, and there's going to be someone that's willing to put in 80 hours. It doesn't matter how smart you are at that point. If they're going to outwork you by double, like, you're done. And so I hate this kind of like, that's the part I hate about this work life balance trend, is that people think they're talking about boundaries and kind of
mhm,
all this other stuff, which is like fine if you want a mediocre life.
mhm,
That's fine. I'm not telling anyone they have to go want to be like build a business that wins. I'm not telling anyone they have to be a pro athlete. But if you say you want to do those things, you better get really real about what it's going to take, right? Because like, otherwise you're just fooling yourself. And so that's kind of like why I try to push back on all these young founders. I see they're like, yeah, I'm doing this, but at the same time, I'm going to go to Coachella. I'm like, well,
mhm,
then you're not going to make it. Like, let's just be super real about this. Because like I love living in reality,
mhm.
right? And I love the idea of hard work and kind of all the what seem to be old school like things to value these days, which is kind of insane to me. Even like generating a profit in your business seems to be some kind of like old school thing, right? It's just like, guys, come on, we need to get back to like, this is hard work and we got to
Mhm,
do it right. So yeah, long-winded position, but
mhm.
I'm just define what the work is, right? The work is everything making you better at what the desired outcome is.
I think that's a really good point. I think one of the big issues with work life balance is the idea that balance always seems like 50-50, where it's like, hey, you have to, if I work from like, 40 hours and I do this for 40 hours, I need a complete balance. But like you said, you can't really have a balanced life if you want to be above the normal. Like, balance is good for everyone. But I think that what you touched on was, I think, what funny enough, a lot of young founders on the opposite end say they're like, I don't need sleep, I don't need to eat. I'll eat when I'm rich. Like, I'll eat healthy when I have money. Like, I'll sleep when I'm dead. But then, as you know, being an athlete, like, it's impossible to compete with no rest. Like, rest is by far important. Now, I think there's always obviously a line of like, are you sleeping like you said for performance, or are you just being like, you know what, I'm gonna call it a lazy day. I'm not gonna wake up and kind of work. But I think one thing that's really interesting I've seen over the past few years, especially with entrepreneurship, is when I talk to them like, hey, like, how do you people are talking like, how do you be successful? And they're like, okay, like, how much sleep are you getting? How are you eating? Are you working out? Are you being active? And I remember back in the people were like, no, that's a waste of time. Like, working out's a waste of time. And then you talk to a few high successful people and they're like, what's your key? And they're like, working out. I have to be active because, like you said, how can you think straight and be creative if you feel like shit? And that's the big thing. Like, they're all interconnected. And I think it's interesting perspective for you, especially because you came from the athletic world where it's very hard to perform optimally if you don't live optimally to some extent. And especially with your health. And I think that's an interesting thing now, how health has become such a big part of it most of the time. Obviously, some days you have to work crazy hours, but on average, have to kind of balance out to be able to not burn out. One thing you also talk about all, and what I think is always interesting with founders is what is the difference, especially early on, from working towards something and planning. So there's always like planning versus action. How do you balance that out? Because obviously you can go, try everything out, but sometimes you do have to step back and say, okay, let me think this through. How do you do that balance? Because I feel there's a pressure to do action, but there's also pressure of going the wrong direction without considering where you're going.
Yeah, I think that I would give different answers depending on where the founder is in their journey. I think in the early days, your default should be action because
Mhm,
what information are you using to plan that's actually beneficial? Like you have no historical data, you have no experience, you've never really even done anything, assuming this is their first time.
mhm,
So like just start doing. Doing is going to be your best teacher at that point. um, I think as you kind of evolve a little bit, maybe you got a year or two under your belt, this is where you should maybe start doing some forecasting, and you should start doing some short-term planning
mhm,
around like what's working, what's not working, more iterating, more kind of like making changes on the fly and applying some level of hindsight and data. And then certainly as you get more mature, like where we are, in our fifth, sixth year,
mhm,
we have a lot of data, and at a certain point in business it becomes a little more of kind of like a spreadsheet
mhm,
problem in a bit, and it becomes like there's just levers to pull. There's certainly planning you need to do, mainly so like it goes from kind of like this like hacking it together and sort of building to like we need to build a structure now that
mhm,
supports a lot of weight, and so we need to be a little more methodical about this. So yeah, it depends. However, like we still default to action because like that's how we learn a
mhm,
lot of our most important lessons. But you definitely want to layer in more planning as you evolve because like a the consequences of getting the decisions get much larger, and the consequences as a result get much larger. And so if you haven't done the appropriate planning, it can be more of a death blow versus in the early days. It's like what you didn't, you spent a few $100 on Facebook and it didn't work, who cares,
mhm,
Whereas you spend $1 million, it didn't work. That kind of sucks, and that matters a little bit.
mhm,
So yeah, but definitely for like young entrepreneurs, which I'd imagine kind of like a lot
mhm,
listen to this and stuff, like just go. Like just like get it done, get shit done, talk to your customers, um, plan a couple days out, but man, don't like waste your time spending a bit like writing a business plan or
mhm,
something like that. Like it's or do it and then just to kind of like teach yourself how useless it is, like do it and then get to work for a month and then go read it and see how wrong you were, right? And if that's not eye-opening enough, then like I don't know what will be, because I know we made like a business plan to try and get like our first checking account open at the bank, like
mhm,
the first few weeks of starting our business. And I know after like reading that 4 page or whatever, like a month later, I was like, this is ridiculous. Like things have changed so much. And today it's comical. I still have it, but it's
mhm,
absolutely hilarious how we were thinking back then. Um, so, anyways, yeah, long-winded answer, but yeah, I think it depends on the time. And the early days definitely default to just starting and learning and iterating because like you don't have much information to even plan on.
I think that's really funny you speaking about the business plan because I remember a few founders kind of going to VCs or like trying to raise funding, and they had this like 20, 30-page business plan, and they were just like they just threw it out there like you don't know anything, and in a year, how there was like a 5-10 year plan there, and they were like in either like a crypto or a new market. They're like the industry is a year old. How do you possibly know what's happening in 10 years? Let alone you have like no sales, and now you're trying to be $1 billion. Like it's impossible to plan, and like you said getting results early on is so important because then you at least have some facts to be based on. Because I know it's like analysis paralysis. People are like, I built this huge model to calculate it, and you're like, you could have just talked to a customer and got the exact same answer in 5 seconds, especially early on. So you're having some success now, and the business is growing past all these years. But what's always interesting I found is that with companies that grow is that what you do as a founder and a CEO kind of changes over the years. Was there anything that you found shocking that once the business started growing that you realized like, oh damn, I have to change what I'm doing? And has there been anything else that you wish you could still do, but now that the company is bigger, you can't do anymore because of your time or because you have to delegate that work?
Yeah, it definitely changes over time, and it seems to kind of happen all at once because like the big shift is really going from doing the work to delegating the work. Um, and that happens at a certain team size, and that happens, usually at an inflection point because there's this kind of weird thing I've experienced where for a long period of time you can increase revenue at a much higher rate than people, and then all of a sudden it flips. Every job that like one person was doing five different jobs, and the revenue was at some other
Mhm.
point. At a certain point, that person has to like split into five people, and revenue doesn't 5x in that same period.
Interesting.
And so I've found that to be like in our business around $10 million. That's when that kind of like exploded itself. Where like we were for the longest time we were like four or five, six
Mhm.
people, and then all of a sudden we were 20, and revenue obviously didn't 4x in that short period of time either. Right, that would
Mhm.
be insane. So and this happens. There's like these different levels of these different growth periods in the
Mhm.
business where salaries would be higher or whatever. But um, so that was kind of one thing, and that's when the team size got big enough, and so my job shifted a lot more towards like planning around like how do we build systems with this
Mhm.
many people now, because the number one thing that's going to happen when you go from 4 to 15 or 20 people is, oh yeah, I don't like interact with every one of them anymore. So like
Mhm.
my thinking and where we're going in the business, it needs to be relayed down through some sort of structure, through some sort of processes,
Mhm.
through some sort of guidelines, all that corporate stuff that you kind of shake your head at as a founder in the early days. You're like mission, vision, values. Like what the? I don't have time for this shit. Like, and then like all of a sudden it's important,
Mhm.
and not that it never was. Just those are the things that like you need to worry about like later.
Yeah.
Like again to the business plan. Like our vision is this. It's like just make a product. Like
Yeah.
let's start there. So that was probably the biggest change. And then yeah, just like delegating. I would say like well, and then the more recent one, if we kind of grown to our current
Mhm.
size, is actually kind of like entering the arena of bigger business where um, you're dealing on a more competitive landscape with things like cease and desists and kind of threats of legal action and just stuff that happens when you get to a certain
Mhm.
size. So that's been definitely a learning curve. So like my job today is, like really working on the future of the company, working on really high level kind of product and
Mhm.
marketing strategy, business planning, and then just, just building the corporation in a way that scales over
Mhm.
time, and is protected and is thoughtfully created. So I don't particularly love like spending a ton of my time like dealing with legal and stuff like
Mhm.
that. So like I definitely miss just being in the weeds on new product development.
Mhm.
If I had to choose one or the
Yeah.
other, I really like get a lot of energy from the actual kind of like building of what we're doing. But
Mhm.
like now my job's not so much that. And I think you have to like the success of a founder, maybe transitioning from founder to CEO. Like I obviously like had a CEO title from
Mhm.
the beginning, but like was I really? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like for a long time it's like self-appointed and like who fucking cares? So
Mhm.
and then at a certain point you become a CEO. Like we've raised millions of dollars, we've done tens of millions of revenue, we've got a bunch of people. It's like, okay, when is that point and what's the new role look like? Um, and I'm just learning to love that role because the
Mhm.
reality is I'm not going to be able to go back and be like the scrappy founder, at least in this business, maybe in
Mhm.
future things. But I actually kind of like this. If I had to start over, because I've like helped advise and I'm
Mhm.
like working with other young founders doing cool things, and I just don't want to get into the weeds. I'm just like, hey, like come back to me with like an update and I'll
Mhm.
advise, but like I'm not gonna go write the kind of like brief to the Upwork,
Mhm.
designer to create a brand package. And I'm just like, I just can't be bothered anymore. Um, so yeah, I do enjoy where it shifted to, and I think that's your job as a founder if you want to kind of stay in that position for the long term, is to evolve with the company and learn to love business. Because now I feel like we're just playing business versus kind
Mhm.
of like in our own little lane. So um, yeah, I've enjoyed it, but it's changed a lot and will continue to change. And we have investors now too, so
Mhm.
like a big part of what I do is reporting and all that stuff, which I really enjoy because like we've got a really smart group of
Mhm.
investors and they challenge me to really think through past decisions and future decisions. And an exercise for me is reporting every quarter on what
Mhm.
did we get wrong, what did we get right, what are we going to do about it. And I think that level of accountability, especially for someone like me who's kind of like the solo founder,
Mhm.
is super beneficial.
I like how you touched on the like inflection point at like that 10, 15 employee level. Cause I talk to a lot of founders who say that there is a point like at that 10 employee, then 100 employee where there's a shift. Like you can't be I guess when you start a lot of times people just hire their friends, but then you have to like hire people who are very specific, and you're not the one on the ground every day. You have to start delegating work. And they're saying how like it sounds simple. Everyone knows you have to do that, but when it happens, you're like, oh damn, like I have to learn other skills. I have to not be a different person, but like I have to change what my role is. And I think it's always an interesting, like you said, inflection point where you're like, oh, I have people depending on me now. Now it's not just me going out and trying to make all these sales. It's like, oh, I have 10, 15 employees who have lives that I'm responsible for setting the vision. And like how you made kind of the mission, vision, values. That's always funny because I remember talking to a lot of, even myself on a few projects, like, this is useless. Like, why would you need that? But then when you start delegating work and people are like, what's the point of this company? And you're like, what, you don't know? And then
Yeah.
they're like, yeah, I just got hired. How do I know? You're like, like your whole story of being a professional athlete. And you're like, okay, there is a reason there are these like mission statements that always seem fake until you're in a company and you're like, what is our end goal? Kind of delegating that down is always a funny part. That the mission, vision, value stuff is always super interesting because half the time you think it's fluff, but then when you don't have one, it is hard to get employees or at least other people to understand why your company is different or what makes you kind of tick as an organization. A lot of times those are obviously embodied by the founder as well.
Yeah, you got it. Exactly.
So, you've had a pretty unique experiences and, to where you got today. Has there been anything, I guess, what has there been going from professional athlete? Was there any skills or anything that didn't seem business related that was a skill you developed outside the business world that's really helped you today that you can kind of point a finger to?
I would say like the number one, which would be relevant across any sport, transitioning into business would be just the resilience that you have to have as an athlete. I think what sport teaches you, um, which again is obvious, but not in being kind of like taught in upcoming generations and cultures, is that like nothing is owed to you, everything is earned. And so sport, you can't just show up to the start line and like win. You have to like do the work, right? No one's going to help you. You're not going to get a pass if you show up to the marathon and you haven't trained. Like it's going to be obvious.
Hmm.
Whereas like nowadays, I'm pretty sure you can't even fail university, right? Like it's like teachers get sued if they don't
Hmm.
like pass a student. It's completely ridiculous. So I love sport for that fact that like there's still really hard lines in the sand around like performance and results, and you're held to that because there's just nowhere to hide,
Hmm.
which you kind of mentioned earlier, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so that's what I think I've learned is like I don't expect anyone to help.
Hmm.
Like I love when they do, but at the end of the day, it's like this is on me to continually try to improve, and on our team to continually try to improve, and that like we're gonna lose a lot more than we win. When I was racing, we would I would do like 15 to 20 races a year and win a handful. So
Hmm.
like objectively, I was failing far more than winning.
Hmm.
Um, and you have to learn that like that's just how the game works, and every one of those failures are how you get better for the future, and you hope that you win a little bit more, and you learn all the most important lessons. And so I think if you don't have that built into you and you start business, it's going to be a hard road of learning that like, oh, I don't just it's not just up and to the right every
Hmm.
day. Like hell no, it's not. Like this is, like I said, a full contact sport, and you can only really understand what I mean if you get into it and start building a business and like what that really means. It's like there's just shit coming at you every day. Everyone looks at entrepreneurs and like, yeah, there's a lot of freedom, there's a lot of highs, but it's
Hmm.
you see the highlight reel. You don't see the 3 a.m. wake up panic sweat.
Yeah.
Like you just like you don't see that. You see the tip of the iceberg. So, but yeah, ultimately resilience and an understanding that we learn a lot more in our failures, and generally those failures are there to teach us and not try and take us out in the long run.
Hmm. Think resilience is obviously a very important thing, and I also think from coming from sport is the like the training aspects. I think in business, like you said, you only see the successful parts of successful entrepreneurs. Like, wow, they took this business from nothing to $1 billion in such a short period of time. But you don't see the other 20 years of them working on 7 other companies and like learning from the industry experts and like being an apprentice, like all these other skills no one talks about. They're just like, wow, this founder out of nowhere and they made it. But if you ever look through their histories of like most successful people, it's like, oh, they've been doing this for 30 years. Like this has been their life. It's not like every athlete. It's not like, oh, they just went to the race line, like you said, and just won the marathon. It's been like, oh no, they've been training their whole life. And now that they're successful, it looks like it's easy for them because they have that like 20 years of grit to back up the effort they're putting in now. So
Yeah, I would say like a real life example is like it's been 6 years, and for like 5 years of that, I didn't get asked to go on podcasts. I didn't go on anything. I didn't pop my head up. I didn't post on LinkedIn like I do now. I have a bit of a following. I'm getting asked to do shows. It's because I did the work, like, and what's really important to highlight is everything I'm talking about. Like I didn't read about. I didn't have someone helping. Like it's because I just went through the shit for 5 years and like learned these lessons the hard way, and there's just no way around that. And so like some of my other things of like how to spot an entrepreneur that's not going to make it, one's like, hey, they're talking about work life balance early in the journey. The other is that they're like signing up for podcasts and doing talks when they're 1 year in. It's like, what do you really know? I mean, it's like this is not a hype game as much as you want to put entrepreneur in your Instagram bio and look cool. Like this isn't cool until you do the work, right? And I still have a lot of work to do. We'll talk again in 5 years and we'll see where we're at. But like, it's just important to highlight that everything I'm talking about is like a lived experience. It's not something I'm regurgitating that I kind of read pre-interview or whatever, right? Like, and I could go deep on everything we talked about because it's been a long journey for 6 years. So yeah, I think you're right. It's just it just takes time, and you gotta put in the work, and understand that like it's you have to be improving every day, because someone else will do the work. And it's like these opportunities are not to be taken for granted because they're really unique, and they're special, and you better work hard.
it's funny. I heard a saying, and this is very relevant. Is I heard it says you can't learn to ride a bike by reading a book, and it's the same thing for business. You can reading does help, but you can't create a business by just reading. You have to have the actions and put them in place and try. And yeah, I remember someone telling me. I remember talking like, oh, I read this book. How for this mall? And they're like, you can't. Have you ever tried? You can't read a book to ride a bike. You have to do it. Having some knowledge obviously helps of like what you're supposed to do, but action is the best course for improvement. And I mean, you've touched on that multiple times. And I think if for anyone who's ever done any sport, like you watch it on TV, you're like, now I'm becoming a professional basketball player. Then you try basketball, you're like, God damn, I can't dunk the ball. There's all these training that's so much harder. On TV, it looks so easy. And I think that's the same for business. They're like, yeah, I read this book about Amazon. I'm gonna start my Amazon, but life's challenging, but experience by doing is probably the best thing. So, obviously you've had some pretty great success, and now you become more vocal. If people want to follow along, kind of learn more about your story, getting your product, what's the best way to get in contact and kind of follow the journey?
Yeah, the best way, like I'm pretty active on both LinkedIn and Twitter, and it's just you can find me at Rob Fraser with two B's, ROBB Fraser, on both platforms. And in terms of the business, yeah, it's Outway, and you can just find us at outway.com, at Outway Socks and all the socials. Yeah, and if anyone got any value like this, wants to kick more, like LinkedIn's a good place to reach out. Twitter, if you want to try the product, you got some value, and you want to find a way to say thanks and just buy our socks because they're awesome, and you'll thank yourself for them too. We got even if you want to hold out, we've got our kind of like Black Friday holiday stuff coming up in the end of November. So yeah, I mean, always stoked to connect with people, and just kind of, I just try to post and share the journey, like what's real, like what's going on, not sometimes some highlight stuff, because why not? And things are cool that we do, but for the most part, just like, here's the reality, because a lot of the noise on Twitter and LinkedIn is kind of like those people selling the dream. They're not living the dream, like, and I try to battle them every day possible. Be like, this ain't real. Like what you're saying is not real. And to close, like on the whole work-life balance thing on LinkedIn, I've never had a founder disagree with me. The only people that have ever disagreed with me were non-founders and people trying to sell founders the idea that balance exists. So someone proved me wrong, and I'm happy to listen. I'm always happy to be wrong, but I just know if you want to be great in sport and business, like balance is not happening, at least in the traditional notion of balance. But I'll close on that because it's so important to make sure you tune out the noise of the people that are just irrelevant, right? Like it's just like if you want to be great an entrepreneur, listen to great entrepreneurs, not the people that are trying to bring them down or sell something. Be very wary of the people trying to sell things to entrepreneurs.